All right, so we're going to pick up this time with the cerebral cortex. So last time we talked about the dedicated areas, the brainstem, the limbic system. Each of them had specific structures. Remember, they each had shapes. They were dedicated areas that they were located. But this time we're going to talk about the cerebral cortex, which is everything else. It's all the stuff you think of when you think brain, right? It's all the kind of squiggly pink stuff that surrounds and kind of encases the limbic system and then the brainstem. So the lobes, the cerebral cortex is kind of a gray bark structure that's wrinkled in order to create more surface area. So if you've ever wondered why there were wrinkles, well, because the wrinkles allow for us to squeeze more neurons in. There's 20 plus billion neurons in our brain. The inner white stuff are axons linking parts of the brain. And then there are 180 plus billion glial cells, which feed and protect neurons and assist neural transmission. So glial cells are kind of like glue cells. They allow all of the neurons to communicate, and they kind of give them the necessary energy and food, in a sense, that they need to grow and transmit and do what they're supposed to do. We have over 30 billion synaptic connections in our brain. Okay, and when we're talking about the organization of the brain, okay, we talk about the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Okay, so these are the two kind of hemispheres, I guess, sides of our brain, in a sense. And then within the two sides, we have the frontal lobe, which is the front, the parietal lobe, which is in kind of the top back, the occipital lobe, which we've talked about, which is the in the lower back of the head, and then the temporal lobe, which are on the side by the temples. This area down here, this is the cerebellum. So just to kind of preview what the lobes are and what they do, each of them has kind of dedicated functions. The frontal lobes are involved in speaking, muscle movements, and making plans and judgments. Remember, the frontal lobe is the one that is still developing in you guys. So this is where a lot of our higher level functioning comes from. The ability to think ahead, the ability to make good judgments, the ability to control our emotions. And there is some speech areas involved in the frontal lobes as well. The parietal lobes is primarily involved with sensory experiences. Our sensory cortex is located in the front of the parietal lobe. Our occipital lobes is predominantly vision. This includes the visual areas. It receives visual information from the opposite visual field. Now, one of the things to remember about our brain is that the left side of our left brain, or left hemisphere, controls the right side of our body, and our right hemisphere controls the left side of our body. Okay, so, and again, we talked about vision. The stuff that our left eye sees is processed in our right occipital lobe. And then our temporal lobes, which are our temples. This is predominantly where auditory kind of processing takes place. So again, you need to make sure that you can identify and describe the four lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. All right, so two of the most important areas kind of in our brain are the motor and sensory strips. Now, the motor strip, okay, think of these as kind of like headbands on the top of our head. The motor strip is located at the back of the frontal lobe. The sensory strip is located at the front of the temporal lobe. Okay, and then the fissure, okay, which is kind of a fancy word for break, I guess. The fissure between the two is what separates those two lobes. Okay. So, and again, with the whole like hemisphere specialization, the left hemisphere controls the right side of your body. Okay, the right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. Now, each of these strips has dedicated areas on them to a corresponding either motor area of your body or to a sensory area of your body. So if we look at these pictures, you can see that, you know, for instance, your hips and knees and ankles and toes are all located kind of at the top inner side of your sensory and motor strips, whereas your face, tongue, those kinds of things are located more along the side of your head over here. Okay, now, and again, the left has one side and the right has one side. So these continue, so your right knee would be about like here maybe, and your left knee would be about here maybe. Okay, and the same goes with sensory. Now, one of the things, the reason why these pictures are also kind of crazy warped is that the more information, or the more, sensory, for instance, information they need, the more cortical area they're going to get. Okay, so for when I'm moving my hands around when I'm lecturing, okay, it's my motor area that is telling my hand to move. So it sends the message from the motor cortex to my arm that says, okay, move. Now, when I touch my head and I'm feeling this, okay, the sensory message is going from my hand up my arm to my head to say, oh, that's right, she's patting her head, and I can feel that both on my head and on my hand. And so the sensory information kind of comes up where the motor information goes down. So the sensory functions of the cortex. Okay, so again, we have each of our 5 senses, or our 4 major senses, because smell has the olfactory bulb, have dedicated areas of the cortex that we call, the auditory, the visual, the sensory cortexes. That's their specialization. So we just talked about the sensory strip, which deals with information from touch. Okay, the occipital cortex, or the occipital lobe, deals with the visual information. The auditory lobe deals, or the auditory information is dealt with in our temporal lobe. So you can kind of remember that by, temples, ears close together. So temporal lobe, auditory information. Okay, and then, yeah, the sensory strip is in our parietal lobe. So don't forget that sensory strip, parietal lobe. Now, how do we know about this? Well, we do things like fMRIs. So for instance, in here, you can see that this person is looking at a photograph, and we will watch which areas of the brain light up. And this is kind of how we've been able to identify all of these different cortexes. Because again, remember, the cortexes are just areas, bundles of neurons that activate in certain things, versus, when we talked about the brainstem, and we talked about the limbic system, where there's actual physical structures. So the association areas are basically everything else that doesn't have a dedicated use. Okay, so, and that's one of the things that set higher level primates apart, and higher level animals apart. The more complex animals have more cortical space devoted to integrating and associating information. So the association areas that we talk about, obviously, are basically places that we make associations, and this is what allows us to think. This allows us to understand. This is what allows us to learn. So if we look at a rat, you can see the red is the motor, and the yellow is the sensory, and the pink is the association areas. Rats have very, very small amounts of association areas, which one of the reasons why rats will run through mazes endless amounts of times for the same reward, because they don't have that ability to make that association, unlike a human, right? We could only get you to run through a maze so many times before you say, okay, cool, I'm done. Cats have a little bit more, chimpanzees obviously have much more, and then human beings have a large amount of cortical space. So the frontal lobe association areas are kind of our executive functions: planning, judgment, inhibition of impulses, right? The ability to kind of think ahead, the ability to judge before acting, the ability to, kind of say, not a good idea, even though I really, really want to do this right now, not going to do it. They're also active for working memory and the processing of new memories. Okay, so again, whenever we're talking about memory formation, the hippocampus kind of takes it. We work with it in our hippocampus, and the hippocampus allows us to think. The frontal lobe kind of allows us to think about it. It's kind of our conscious area. It allows us to really kind of work with information when we're talking, about memory formation as well. Now, Phineas Gage, remember we talked about him earlier in the week. He was our guy with our, the railroad spike through the eye. And when his frontal lobe was damaged, he became rude, odd, irritable, and unpredictable. And the reason for that is that, the frontal lobes, the loss of the frontal lobe resulted in the loss of his ability to suppress impulses and modulate emotions. So again, he kind of became a teenager. No, just kidding. You're all wonderful, except third period. All right, the parietal lobe association areas, okay? So again, frontal lobe, thinking, judgment, planning, all of those kinds of things. Parietal lobe is more along the lines of sensory information, because remember, motor area is at the back of the frontal lobe, sensory area, sensory cortex is at the front of the parietal lobe. So this part of the brain has many functions in the association areas beyond just the sensory strip. Okay, so we manage input from multiple senses. The parietal lobe does a lot of kind of like helping out the thalamus to figure out where all of these senses should go and making sense of all of these senses. We perform a lot of spatial and mathematical reasoning in this parietal lobe. We monitor the sensation of movement here. Oops. Okay, so the parietal lobe does have more than just sensory information. Spatial and mathematical, sensation of movement, all of those things kind of go along in our parietal lobe. Now, the temporal lobe association areas, again, temporal lobe, okay, kind of auditory form. Some of the abilities managed by the association areas in this are recognizing specific faces. Okay, so a lot of our facial identification does come from the temporal lobe. And then also managing sensory input related to sound, which helps us understand the spoken words. Okay, so a lot of our auditory stuff is processed through our temporal lobe. Now, the whole brain association activity involves complex activities which require communication among the association areas across the brain. So, it's very rare that our brain, just one of our association areas is activated. We're constantly using all of these areas because we're constantly bombarded with all of this sensory input. So some examples of this, for instance, would be memory, language, attention, meditation and spirituality, and just consciousness. Okay, being aware, being awake, being alive requires your whole brain. So even though we have the dedicated areas of the brain that we know that this is kind of what they specialize in, we can't forget that they don't ever, or they rarely act alone. There's this whole brain kind of association that's constantly occurring. All right, in our next video, we are going to pick up with kind of speech.